What can we most hope for in life? What can we most hope for our children? As you know, Freud and Schopenhauer told us the best we could ever do in life was not to be miserable, not to suffer, that the best we could ever do in life was approach zero. But when you lie in bed at night, you're not thinking about how to go from -8 to -5. You are, for the most part, thinking about how to go from +2 to +6. So what I want to talk about today is the possibility that there is life above zero, and that human flourishing, well-being, is what we can hope for our future. I believe the thesis that the best we can do in life is to relieve misery is empirically false, it's morally insidious, and it's politically a dead end. So I'm going to talk about the opposite today. Here's what we'll do in a half an hour. I've just said what we can most hope for in life. I'm going to argue and show you some data that well-being itself is a plausible individual and a national goal, and that it's something well over and above the absence of misery. Then the question is, can it be defined reasonably well, and what is it we would want to build? I don't know if there will be a positive human future, but I don't think there's going to be one unless we can define in what it might consist and investigate how those building blocks can happen. I'm going to suggest to you that PERMA, positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment are the constituents, the elements of well-being. And I'll show you some data, new data from Europe, in which 23 of the European Union nations are compared on PERMA. Then, having said it's a plausible thing to measure, I'm going to ask the question, well, can you build it, or is well-being like your waistline? You probably know dieting is a $50 billion scam. Any of you can lose 5% of your body weight in about 3 weeks by following any diet on the bestseller list. I did the watermelon diet. I lost about 20 pounds in 3 weeks. I had diarrhea for 3 weeks. And the reason dieting is a scam is 80 to 95% of people regain all that weight or more over the next 3 years. So the issue is, can PERMA, can well-being be lastingly increased, or does it just flop back to your old curmudgeonly state in time? And I'm going to suggest to you that we know something about how to build it, that it's not like dieting, and indeed is not like psychotherapy for what's wrong. So I'll tell you a little bit about the science of P, positive emotion, the science of E, engagement, and what I'm going to do as I do this is try to tell you something that your grandmother and your minister did not know, things I didn't know 20 years ago that have been discovered in the science. I'm going to talk about relationships and a major new technique that has been discovered that builds relationships, talk about meaning, and about accomplishment, and particularly self-discipline. Then we'll be about 20 minutes through the lecture at that point, and what I'll have said is that we know something about how to build these things at an individual level, on a one-to-one basis. There's good reason to believe they can increase. Can this happen in schools, in large organizations? That's the stepping stone to the possibility that the planet could flourish. And so I'm going to talk about this having been done in a huge organization, the United States' second largest employer, the United States Army, which decided 3 years ago to teach resilience and positive psychology to all 1.1 million soldiers and measure the outcome. So I'll argue that it's a plausible goal for large units. And finally, I'm going to talk about the politics of all of this. This is political. It's not political in the sense of left versus right. Left versus right, to my mind, is the question of, given that we agree on goals like wealth or military adventurism, who carries them out? Are they carried out by individual or by state means? This is not about who does it. This is about a different set of political ends. So that's what we'll do in the next 25 minutes. And let me start with PERMA. So this is my theory of positive emotion. So for me, well-being consists of 5 elements. An element contributes to well-being, an element is pursued for its own sake, not merely to get one of the other elements. So for example, we have no interest in IQ in itself. We're interested in IQ because we think it leads to intelligent decision making. So an element is pursued for its own sake, and the element can be measured independently of the other elements. And I believe there are 5 elements that free people choose in life. The first is positive emotion, the smiley face, happyology, hedonics, part of the name of this conference. But positive psychology does not stop with positive emotion, and part of the reason is how much positive emotion you feel is about 50% heritable, and it's only increasable by 10 to 15%. So we know techniques for having you live in the upper part of your set range for happiness, for positive emotion. But positive psychology is also concerned with engagement. When time stops for you, when you're one with the music. So looking at you, about 70% of you right now are completely engaged in what I'm saying. The other 30% of you are having sexual fantasies, by the way. So we're interested in when people go into flow. We're interested in relationships with other. And that's crucial because if you think about when you're in your highest positive states, it's almost never solitary. Think about the happiest you've ever been. I have no idea what it'll be, but it's almost always going to be with other people. Very interesting. We've evolved to be hive creatures. The hedonic system is built around other people. Meaning and purpose, belonging to and serving something bigger than the self. The self is completely impoverished soil for well-being. And finally, human beings pursue accomplishment, achievement, mastery. So I'll talk about each one of those in turn. Importantly, if I had suggested 30 years ago that well-being as defined by PERMA were a plausible political goal, national goal for a nation, it would have been a silly suggestion because it wasn't measurable. Well, what's happened in the last 30 years is each of these elements is now respectably measurable, that probably as well measured as things like GDP. And indeed, that's one of the reasons that the Prime Minister of England, David Cameron, has decided to measure the well-being of the entire British population, and most importantly, to hold himself accountable for the success or failure of public policy by changes in well-being. And most importantly, they're not like the dieting scam. Each of these things is teachable. You can actually have more of each of PERMA in your life, and I'll just talk a little bit about the research on this. So let me start with the measurement question. Is this, in order to be a plausible national or planetary goal, it has to be measurable. So here's what Timothy So and Felicia Huppert did last year. They went to 23 European Union nations and asked PERMA questions of 2,000 adults in each of those nations. And they asked what percentage of adults are flourishing by PERMA criteria. And Denmark, as usual, leads the pack with almost 40% flourishing. The UK and Germany are in the middle. France and the former Soviet Union are at the bottom with under 15%. No one's done this for Australia or for the United States for that matter, so we don't know where Australia and the United States sit. We will indeed soon. That was part of what I was doing in South Australia, and tomorrow I'll talk about what I was up to in South Australia for the last month. But anyway, what this slide shows, it's measurable, and there are very large country-to-country differences, and most importantly, there's very large room for improvement. It's commonly said that our children will not have as much money as we do. I'm not an economist, I don't know if that's true, but there is plenty of room for our children to be happier, to flourish, to have more well-being than we do. And that is indeed the theme of what this is about. So let me now go through PERM&A for individuals, just telling you a little bit of the science that I didn't know 20 years ago, and a little bit of how these things are built. So let's take positive emotion, happiness. It turns out that if you go to companies and you look at how they're doing economically, and you count every word that's said in business meetings, there is something called a Losada ratio. And it distinguishes economically flourishing from stagnant, from about to go bankrupt companies. So the ratio of positive words to negative words in business meetings for flourishing companies is above 2.9 to 1. Between 1 and 2.9 to 1, the companies are stagnating, and below 1, the companies are going under. Now, don't take this home to your married life. 2.9 to 1 leads to divorce. And the reason we know that is John and Julie Gottman take couples and they lock them into an apartment for a weekend, and they record everything that's said, and they compute the Losada ratio. And if the ratio is under 5 to 1, it predicts divorce. Now, what's going on here? Well, I think it is that we often have to criticize and say bad things to our spouses, to our children, to the people that work for us. And the question is, against what background of positivity will they hear us? Will they not think we're their enemy? And indeed, this was brought home to me by my teenage daughter, Nikki. Nikki, you last heard about when she was 5 years old and called me a grouch and founded positive psychology because she was right on the money. Well, about 4 years ago, she was a junior in high school, majoring in entitlement. And I came home one evening and I was all excited about the Losada ratio, and I told the family about it, and then I went to work on the computer. It was a Thursday night, and about 11 o'clock, Nikki came downstairs and said, "Daddy, will you drive me to a party?" And I shouted at her, 11 o'clock, Nikki, get to work, it's a Thursday night. And she looked at me and she said, "Daddy, you've got a terrible Losada ratio." And the question is, to raise children, what ratio of positive to negative things do we need? And the answer is no one knows. That's a little bit about the P. Engagement. I asked the question before, when do you go into flow? When does time stop for you? And the answer is we go into flow when our highest strengths are just matched to the challenges that come our way. That's when we go into flow. And so we're very interested in increasing the amount of flow we have in life. And to do that, you have to identify people's highest strengths. This is all free, by the way. Part of my job has been in positive psychology, has been to give this away. So there's a website, AuthenticHappiness.org, that 2.5 million people have gone to and taken the test. It has a signature strengths test on it, which tells you what your 5 highest strengths are. Now, here's the kind of exercise that we do against random assignment placebo-controlled. And by the way, when I say an exercise works, it doesn't mean I kind of think it's a good idea. It means that I've actually run large-scale random assignment placebo-controlled tests of it. In the same way when I worked on drugs and psychotherapy, I would take Prozac and a sugar pill and run them against each other. So here's an exercise that works. I'll do half of it with you now. Close your eyes. Think of something you don't like to do at work, that you have to do pretty much once a week. Okay, open your eyes. Okay, your assignment is go take this test. This will tell you what your 5 highest strengths are. It might be social intelligence, it might be humor and playfulness, and then your assignment is to do that task next week using your highest strength. So, for example, one of my students was a waitress, And she hated waitressing, working her way through graduate school, heavy trays, being patronized by customers. She took the signature strength test. Her highest strength was social intelligence. So her job was to recraft waitressing to use social intelligence much more. So she resolved to make the encounter with her the highlight of every customer's evening. Now notice that wouldn't always succeed, but notice she was putting what was very best inside of her on offer all the time. And waitressing became more fun, the tips became larger. And in controlled studies, if you do this, 6 months later, statistically, less depression, less anxiety, more life satisfaction. Just one little bit of science more. I'm very interested in trauma and post-traumatic growth. I've spent my life working on depression, helplessness, and trauma. And we recently asked the question, who grows through trauma? Of whom is it true what Nietzsche said, if it doesn't kill me, it makes me stronger? And we did a study of 1,700 people who had been through 1, 2, or 3 awful events. We listed the 15 worst things that could happen to people and asked who was stronger afterwards. And it turned out that people who had 3 of these awful things, rape, captured, tortured, were stronger than people who had 2, and who were stronger than people who had 1, who were stronger than people who had none. And the character strengths that correlated with post-traumatic growth were those 5: religiousness, gratitude, kindness, hope, and bravery. So that's a little bit about the science of signature strengths. Relationships. Your spouse comes home from work and she's been promoted. What do you say to her? How many of you are marriage counselors? Anyone a marriage counselor? Okay, well, there are a couple of you. You probably know that marriage counseling is the single worst form of psychotherapy. It has the worst statistics. It's hard to do. People are lying to you. They're lying to each other. When I teach marriage counseling, what you teach people to do is how to fight better. That is, how not to have the same damn fight every single day. You're trying to take insufferable marriages and make them barely tolerable. Now, that's not a positive psychology form of marriage counseling. So Shelley Gable, who I think will be speaking at this meeting, 7 years ago did something tremendously interesting. She said, let's not look at how people fight, let's look at how they celebrate together. So, your spouse comes home from work, she's been promoted. What do you say to her? Well, most people say, and this is what I did before I read Shelley's work, congratulations, dear, well-deserved. Passive, constructive. You might as well not say anything at all. A lot of people, and I work with drill sergeants now, and I'll tell you about them momentarily, do active, destructive. You know what tax bracket that's going to put us in? That's not good. Passive, destructive is what's for dinner? Not good. The one that works, and what Shelley does, is active, constructive, which is that report you wrote for the company on the pension plan. That's the single best report on fiscal matters I've read in my 25 years in business. Now, let's relive what happened today. Exactly where were you when your boss told you were promoted? And exactly what did he say? And what do you think the real reasons are you've been promoted? And how can you use those strengths more with me and with the kids and in church? And it turns out when you do that, love and commitment markedly increase. And it's not just a marital technique, it's a friendship and work technique as well. So that's a little bit on R. M, meaning, belonging to, and serving something bigger than the self. Most of you don't need to know this, but your kids sure do. Here's an exercise we do. We have, my students are asked to do something fun next week a P thing, and to do something philanthropic, and then come back and report what happens. And what happens is quite remarkable. When you do something fun, when it's over, it's over. It has almost no effects afterwards. But when you do something philanthropic, very different thing happens. One of my students, her third grade nephew called her on the phone and had to be tutored for 2 hours in fractions. So she spent 2 hours on the phone doing this. And she said, after that, the whole day went better for me. I was mellow. I could listen to people. People liked me more. And one of my business students said, I'm in business because I want to make a lot of money. And I want to make a lot of money because money brings happiness, it brings control, and it brings security. But I was astonished to find out that I was happier helping another person than I was shopping. And that's the regularity. The one, if you're depressed right now, the one single thing which will give you a temporary boost is to go out and help another person. And lastly, accomplishment, achievement. We're very interested in self-discipline. And we look at academic success, we measure grit and self-discipline and IQ, and we look at various forms of academic success. And quantitatively, we find that self-discipline in young people is roughly twice as important as IQ in predictors of academic success. So that's a flavor of what goes on in the science of positive psychology and in the science of PERMA. And so let me now turn to whether or not this can be done at more than just the individual level. So 3 years ago, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army came to me and said, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicide, depression, panic, drug abuse, divorce. What does positive psychology say about that, Dr. Seligman? And what I said was, people's lives are often ruined by combat, divorce, death of a spouse. But the phenomenon is bell-shaped. And on the left-hand side, you've got what you just described. And you should continue to spend $10 billion a year treating that. But the Army's not a hospital. What you're after is a healthy force that can cope with persistent warfare. In the middle of the bell-shaped curve is resilience. And those are people who go through a tough time, but 3 months later, they're back where they were psychologically and physically. And on the right-hand side, you have post-traumatic growth. People who a year later go through a very tough time at first, but a year later are measurably stronger psychologically and physically than they were. And so General Casey decided he would create something called comprehensive soldier fitness, and he ordered on that very day, unlike what we do, he actually ordered that positive psychology and resilience would be measured and taught throughout the United States Army, and he allocated $145 million to do it, and he created 3 programs that have been in process for 3 years now, and I can show you a little bit about what they do. The first is he was after creating an army that was just as psychologically fit as physically fit. So we had to devise a test of psychological fitness. There are plenty of tests of psychological unfitness. So all 1.1 million soldiers have taken this test, and this is every year, out of 1,200 colonels, 33 are promoted to brigadier general. So we asked the question from the test, could you predict in advance who was going to make it to brigadier general? And when that tells you, you can with considerable accuracy. That's part 1 of comprehensive soldier fitness. Part 2 is General Casey said to me, well, we've read your material on schools, and we see you teach teachers the skills of PERMA, and then you measure their students, and you find their students have better psychological fitness, less anxiety and depression up to 2 years later. Well, that's the Army model. We've got 40,000 teachers in the Army, the drill sergeants. So your job, Dr. Seligman, will be to train all the drill sergeants in the Army, and they will train the 1.1 million soldiers. So now 180 drill sergeants come to the University of Pennsylvania every month, and we teach them the PERMA skills and the PERMA exercises, and we have the first data on it. And it basically shows that if you have had a positive psychology trainer in your company and you're deployed, your psychological strengths go up. If you haven't, they stay the same or go down. And similarly, we found with suicide that soldiers who've had training in PERMA have lower suicide attempts and suicidal ideation than the rest of the troops. So let me conclude. And importantly, this works better in younger soldiers than in older soldiers, and it's part of what we find in working with schools. So let me conclude what I've said today, and it's the politics. It asks the question, what is wealth for? Why do we care about unemployment and GDP? And the reason is, to my way of thinking, what we really care about is well-being. So to my way of thinking, money is in the service of well-being. And indeed, that's what the Prime Minister of England has decided to measure, global well-being. You might think this is an impossible national goal, but when nations are poor and at war and in famine, in plague, they naturally turn to defense and damage. But when nations are wealthy, not in plague, not in famine, not at war, they look for something more in life. This was the question I began by asking, what more is there than the alleviation of misery? Well, Florence is the best example of this, I know. In the 1450s, Florence became tremendously wealthy, mostly due to Medici banking genius. And it asked the question, what should we do with our wealth? And under the leadership of Cosimo the Elder, it decided we should devote our wealth to beauty. Now, I'm not suggesting that Australia, North America, and the European Union take up sculpting at this point. Rather, I'm suggesting that you are at a Florentine moment. You look like Florence, actually look much better than Florence actually looked. And the question is, what are we going to do with this wealth? And what I've suggested is what we're going to do is to increase the well-being on the planet. So I want to close by saying what Nietzsche said about human history. Nietzsche said that human history divides into three phases. The first is the camel. The camel just sits there and moans and takes it. The second phase of human history for Nietzsche is the rebel, the lion. The rebel says no. The rebel says no to poverty, no to discrimination, no to plague. And Nietzsche says, well, I think you have to be blinded by ideology to see that in the last 200 years, the politics of no has worked. There is almost less, there is in fact less of almost every bad thing on the planet than there was 500 years ago. Steve Pinker's book, by the way, best book last year, Better Angels of Our Nature, is about a 30-fold decrease in your probability of violent death over the last 500 years. But the politics of no has worked. And then Nietzsche asks, what can all human beings say yes to? Let's imagine that no worked. Let's imagine we got rid of all the evils in human life. What would we do? And that's what I've tried to say today. That's what the child reborn does. The child reborn says yes. And I would suggest that every human being can say yes to more positive emotion in life. Every human being can say yes to more engagement in life. Every human being can say yes to more noble purpose in life. Every human being can say yes to better human relations. And every human being can say yes to more positive accomplishment. Every human being can say yes to flourishing, and that is the hope for our future. Thank you.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.